Welcome to episode 2 of the Loane Hockey Podcast. And building off what we were talking about yesterday, what's really interesting, really fascinating about off puck play is how that translates to on puck play. And so today in this episode, we're going to talk about linking together on puck play with off puck play. So those two in tandem with each other can be very much a threat for players because some players are really smart without the puck. But when they get the puck, they don't necessarily know what they're doing a lot of the time. Sometimes it panics. Sometimes they really don't know how to utilize their decision making elements within their on puck play. So positional habits and linking those together off the puck and on the puck together is a really important concept when we're talking about on puck play and being able to move fluidly into space and understanding not only systems but tactics that go into understanding those positioning elements. And when it comes to different teams, there's different systems, there's different tactics, there's different positioning habits that teams and coaches have involved with that. But the consistency comes from essentially just positioning element more than anything else, and players being able to fluidly move into space. So, like I said yesterday on that episode, the better a player is able to move into space without the puck, the better space that they're going to be in when they have a retrieval situation, when they have the puck in a situation where it could be a corner battle, it could be a half wall play in the offensive zone. It could be a D zone breakout situation. It could be a middle ice entry. It could be something along the lines of that, where fluid movement becomes very important when it comes to understanding on puck play and on puck decision making as well, especially for young players in today's game. And I think of a few examples. The Chicago Steel are a really good example of how they incorporate fluid movement into their zone structure, but just their overall team structure. Saginaw Spirit, that's another really good example of how they incorporate that fluid movement, not only from their Fs, but also their Ds as well. D1 and D2 are very active and they are not afraid to activate whenever they can. And so it depends on the team. It obviously depends on the players themselves and how players fit the mold into those teams because some players and some teams they might not have D1, D2 activation. They might not have a ton of activation when it comes to linking together those two elements when it comes to off puck play and on puck play. So the less activation, it doesn't really allow the defender to think and process the game fluidly. And going back to the fluid movement example that we're talking about here, with fluid movement, it's constantly being on the go, constantly being in different decision making patterns and understanding different patterns and being able to understand the game in a way that's with pace and it's not stagnating off. So by having that fluid movement element, it forces the not only the forwards but also the defensemen to think and constantly be thinking all the time about what they want to do next. And another really good example when it comes to on puck plays, lateral decision making and lateral playmaking. Not this could be in neutral zone ice, this could be in offensive zone ice. So there's a lot of different situations when it comes to being able to move laterally and being able to move fluidly. So being able to move laterally is one thing, but if you don't link it to anything and you don't do anything in terms of decisions, it can actually slow your transition game up ice. There's certain situations where a north-south game isn't necessarily bad because it can actually create a quicker transition versus a scenario where if you're moving laterally at a slower pace, it's going to take more time to gain entry. It's going to take more time to transition the puck. So by being able to distinguish the two, there's obviously situations where lateral playmaking, lateral seam plays, like across the Royal Road in the offensive zone, for example. And I think of teams like, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Tampa could have been a really good example with that Royal Road playmaking with Kucherov and Stamkos. Stamkos obviously on that far side on that faceoff circle. And I'm trying to think of another team off the top of my head. I remember a few years ago there's Taylor Hall and Jack Hughes on PP1 in New Jersey when Taylor Hall was there before he got moved. And those two are very much a threat. And Taylor Hall is playing really good hockey. I believe for a few seasons with the Devils. I don't quite recall, but just some Royal Road examples and some lateral playmaking examples in the offensive zone. So it distinguishes itself because, like I said before, if you're having lateral playmaking in the neutral zone, it has to be fast. It has to be direct. So you have to intertwine somewhat of a north-south direct game with the east-west game. So how do you balance that? That's the question. And it can be really tricky sometimes when you're trying to link together off puck movement and on puck play. And you're trying to move at a fast pace. So that can be tricky sometimes, but there's more and more systems and tactics being built around it. And again, weak side D activation can be very important in that element to have that diagonal playmaking, diagonal seams open up across the board as well. And we mentioned defenseman being active. Defenseman being active can be a parallel and paradigm shift going off the lateral playmaking element. So by having the D active, it opens up more seams every which way because you're essentially thinking as more of a five-man unit as opposed to positions. You're not thinking about, oh, the center has to be here, the right wing has to be here, the left wing has to be there. The D's have to be in certain situations. They have to be man in the point or something like that in the offensive zone. No. So what it can be essentially is you can have fluid movement from all the players involved. So the players are constantly moving in different positions and they're not really thinking about their role necessarily. Now, this is more of a thing that's evident in offensive zone structure nowadays. And we mentioned Colorado yesterday on the podcast on episode 1 with all puck play as an example of how Colorado is able to they utilize the flanks really well with their defensemen and utilize the so what they do is they're able to essentially create 3 lanes across the width of the ice in the offensive zone, and they have players in each lane. It doesn't matter if they're a defenseman or forward. They have players in each lane, so it's going to open up options. It's going to open up options more so on the width of the ice, and that's very important for the structure of their offensive zone habits and the foundation of how they're still able to create structure within their systems because the movement is purposeful within their offensive zones decision making as well. So again, the weak side D is a really interesting study. He's a really interesting study with a lot of different situations when it comes to diagonal playmaking as well, because there could be a lot of lateral seams that can open up with the weak side defenseman. And we mentioned very briefly about the creating a system element, more so getting the players to think as a habit of a five-man unit as opposed to positions. Because especially nowadays, there's so much pressure on the center to be able to play a 200-foot game and to be able to play reliably in all forms of the rink. And the center, quote unquote, has the most responsibility, but there's a lot of other responsibilities on other players too. Like, say F1 is tracking back and the F1 tracking back is not the center. Well, he could still play like a center for that time being and not necessarily think about, oh, I'm not a center. He could just play the role temporarily and be able to adapt to that. And then once the time comes, ideally a breakout situation comes back out of that, where a transition the other way comes out of that, they're able to think is more of a unit structure rather than just positioning elements. And so for this, it's really important for players to be creative as well. Players have to be creative when it comes to using their instincts and understanding patterns, understanding neutral zone patterns, not understanding offensive zone patterns, and to link together on puck play from off puck play. They have to be creative. They have to use their instincts. They have to be reliable too, but they have to be able to be creative and be able to push pace when they want to and be able to sometimes even if they're a defenseman, they could be creative by activating downhill, activating below the top of the circle. If they're forwards, they could be interchanging with the D, or they could be moving across the zone, across the width of the zone, or creating fluid movement structures. So that way they're able to create a sense of dynamic in how they're attacking. And the instincts element is so important nowadays because players are much more creative in today's game. A lot of players can play skill game and they can play a physical game. It doesn't matter if they're 5'8" or 6'3". A lot of these players are incorporating more of a dual threat element into their game. It's making them really, really dynamic to watch. And there's a few examples I think of from this past draft. I'm not going to get into some right now, but there's some really good examples from this past draft of how you could be a smaller player, you could be a bigger player, but there's different elements that go into these types of players, and they're not just one dimensional. They have various skill sets and various dynamics of their skill that are allowing them to be such effective players, especially inside the top 10 of the 2024 draft. Really fascinating. And close puck support is another really big example when we talk about linking together on puck play and being able to be an option consistently, being able to be in space, being able to be trailing puck carriers sometimes, being able to look away from the play and provide passing lanes, provide diagonal seams, provide lateral seams and lateral passing lanes that open up. So you could be a threat without the puck, you could be a threat with. And there's different elements that go into that as well in terms of being specific in routes as well, because sometimes players can get too close when they're supporting the puck, and that could actually be a bad thing because when you're supporting the too close, I've seen this a lot at the AAA level and the youth level because players that don't necessarily have and haven't developed as much of a hockey sense element to their game yet, especially growing up, they might tend to provide close support a little too close. So it doesn't really open the options to the puck carrier. And it creates essentially almost a corner battle unnecessarily, even though it could be an open ice. So being able to be specific in routes is really important to on puck play and being able to create on puck decisions that are very fluid, very instinctual as well. Creating differentials of speed is another one. And I like to talk a lot about positive speed differential. And positive speed differential is essentially, I like to think of a really good example is Connor McDavid when he's attacking off the rush and he's attacking through the neutral zone, he's attacking up the middle, attacking at his 100 level gear, and he's going against a defenseman. I'm just trying to think of a defenseman. Say Nikita Zadorov, who might not be the fastest and might not be able to match his speed right away. So he's going to have positive speed differential because Zadorov is moving at a lesser pace, McDavid's moving at a faster pace. So the differential of speed favors McDavid. And so being able to have a speed element to the timing, to the routes, to the decision making, and being able to understand differentials of speed can be a really intriguing factor and a really separating factor for some players. Because another example, actually a recent example of a guy who got traded to Edmonton, since we're on the topic of Edmonton, is Matt Savoy, who got traded there recently from Buffalo. And Matt Savoy is a player who can think the game, but he can also play the game at a really intense pace that's hard to match. It's almost like Dylan Holloway in Edmonton a little bit. But Savoy is a little bit faster, but on par in terms of foot speed and how he's able to think. And that allows him to close quicker. That allows him to get to space quicker. That allows him to get and to understand his patterns quick, understand his routes faster. Like he has an advantage because of the fact that he can get to so many different situations at a much faster pace than some players. So this is the advantage that he has because he might be still using a lot of energy, but it's way less energy because he's getting to space much faster than some of these other players. And he's much more efficient at it. So he's able to understand how to force opposing coverage to switch off on their rotations inside the defensive zone much they have to do it much faster and they're not able to catch up to him right away. And we saw this in the WHL with Savoy after he got traded to Moose Jaw from Wenatchee in the middle of the season, where he was when guys would try to close on him, it would not work. And Savoy has obviously been in the WHL for a few years, so naturally he's going to become a more dominant player this past season than ever. But with Savoy, he could attack the game with so many and so much speed and so much positive speed differential that he was able to get to space so much faster individually, and he'd be able to create space effortlessly for himself. Almost in pretty much every shift, he was creating space for himself with the puck in some way. And he's still good at it because players could not match that intensity that he had. And yesterday, we briefly mentioned creating triangles as well, and creating triangles, the importance of being able to be involved in small area space and how Phil Jackson's system is kind of an example of that in how creating triangles on the basketball court in the offensive side of the court. Again, I don't know a ton about basketball, but creating triangles opens up different options in that triangular offense that Phil Jackson had made in the 1990s with the Chicago Bulls. And being able to create triangles can really be an effective habit to linking together the off puck play and the patterning elements with the on puck play, where players are able to get their next puck because you can lead players into those next passes because of those small area triangles. It's almost like another example would be Barcelona when Pep Guardiola had their tiki taka system. I believe this was in, could be wrong, late 2000s, early 2010s. It might have been the early 2010s where Guardiola, when he was there, he implemented that system and he was able to revitalize and create a sense of separation from other teams and how they were creating triangles of space to be able to link together in their next pattern. And the off the ball movement linked together their on the ball movement because players are moving so effectively in small areas without the ball. They would get to their next space and then they would be able to get a lead pass in a really critical area, in a really good area. And lastly, what I want to mention is Adam Boqvist. So Adam Boqvist actually signed with the Florida Panthers today. And Adam Boqvist is a really interesting example because the frequency in how he moves off the puck is really high. So he moves to really good areas without the puck, but when he gets the puck, the frequency and the consistency is not consistent in how he's able to attack. So what's interesting with Florida is how they have obviously Paul Maurice there. Paul Maurice has been much more progressive in how he's been thinking is because in Winnipeg he would have some D1 and D2 activation with their defensemen, not a ton. So sometimes they'd be stagnant at the point. Now there's more, especially in Florida, since they have a lot of analytical minds. Bill Zito's one, and Paul Maurice is definitely one now. And they have more analytical minds. They understand the 5-man unit structure as opposed to just thinking in center, right wing, left wing, and D's. And there's more fluid movement from Florida and how they attack in their systems and how they attack in the offensive zone with their defensemen move downhill, weak side deactivation and stuff like that. So this is going to be really interesting to me to see how Boqvist adapts in that system. Obviously, they're a Stanley Cup champion team with Stanley Cup championship players this past season on there. But with Boqvist, what's going to be really interesting is how much could he actually adapt his on puck play? That's the real question. The frequency and the consistency in his on puck play has to be there in order for him to stay there. Obviously, he's on a 1 year deal with Florida, but again, his movement off the puck is really consistent, and there's a lot of patterns in how he's able to move into space and how he's able to put himself in really good ice for himself to receive passes from teammates. But when he gets the puck, you see sometimes he's wired and sometimes he's panicking and sometimes he's just not making his best decisions. I don't know if that's a mental thing or something else, but with Boqvist, it could be really intriguing. There could be a lot more potential for him in the future if he's able to link together the on puck elements. He's still a young defenseman. He was a top 10 pick in 2018. There's a lot of different offensive habits that his game has to be layered upon. When a player, and he's not the best defensively, but when a player is so good at one thing, and Boqvist most notably offensively, you have to find a way to build off that. And building off his offensive habits can really make him an effective top 4 defenseman as an offensive minded defenseman more than anything else. Since again, there's still some defensive habits that he still needs to fix. And that could be another thing that could revitalize himself a little bit is understanding on puck defensive habits. And that can link better to his on puck offensive play and the consistency because there's some frequency in how he's attacking with the puck, and it's just not there regularly quite yet. But with Boqvist, he's a really intriguing example to me because I was watching some of his game, studying some of his game, and watching him a lot in Chicago obviously helped. But watching him in Columbus and how his game actually adapted there after being traded in 2021 in the Seth Jones deal, understanding his movement with Columbus was really different. And Pascal Vincent played it. They're more of a possession-oriented team where they like to have the puck obviously a lot more, and they like to incorporate different modern day elements into their their play. But there's just times where Bokus wasn't playing that much, and so he wasn't able to get consistent reps. I would be curious now to see how he adapts with more reps, and if he gets more reps. They lost Brandon Montour on the right side in Florida. Not saying he could be a replacement there, but there's certainly potential for him to blossom. We saw Gustav Forsling was a waiver pickup for Florida, so at this point, anything can pretty much happen with how they're able to incorporate different development habits within those young defensemen as well.